Hi, welcome back to another fabulous edition of Alopecia in Life. My name is Christine. I'm very grateful to have you with me today. This afternoon, I thought I would share with you some experiences I've had not wearing a wig, what people have said to me, how I felt, and how I've responded, in case you're ever in that situation, so that you're not as caught off guard or you have a word track to reference. The first experience I had was in 2011 when I went to India for almost a month. I volunteered in an ashram and I wore a headscarf during my time there. It was the first time I had left my wig very far away and was feeling really self-conscious about not having hair. And I know that I carried that self-consciousness around with me until one evening. It was very close to my departure date. I was approached by a young man from Israel. He had just gotten out of his mandatory military service in the Israeli army. And he sat right next to me and he said, just very bluntly, he looked at me and he said, "You have no hair." And it was the thing that I absolutely did not want to talk about with anyone. I was trying to sort of fade away into the corner wherever I was when I was at this ashram, because I was so self-conscious about how I looked. But there it was, right in my face. He was calling it. He was putting it out there for me, and I had nowhere else to go, had nothing else to say. But yes, I have alopecia, and it was a really difficult decision for me to come here without my wig, because I knew there was no way I could really take care of it. And it was, what are you going to do when you're in Southeast India and everything is dirt and there are cows roaming across the highway? I mean, you're not going to be worried about taking care of a wig. And I said, it was really difficult for me to come here because I was worried people would judge me. And he said, again, just very calmly, he looked at me in the eye and he said, "Has anyone ever judged you for it?" And I was, I'm a therapist and I have been a therapist. I've talked with people. I've been on the other side of the conversation and I've been the one sort of observing and looking at how they deal with life and problems and trying to shine a light of my own on areas where they might do well to change their behavior or their thinking. And I thought I had it figured out until this guy, this young man, I think he's 23 years old, asked me, "Has anyone ever judged you for it?" And I had never asked that question of myself. I was so focused on what I lacked, how I had changed and not for the better by losing my hair. Just so focused on all the negatives that I perceived existed in my life. And I know that I took that on in my persona and, in my thoughts and my words, and my actions. And it wasn't until that moment that I thought, oh, wait a second, I am creating this hell for myself that doesn't need to be, just because of how I'm looking at this problem. And so from then on out, I came home, and for several months, my hair actually started to grow back miraculously, but I was wearing a headscarf instead of a wig during that time when I had very short, very, very little hair. And it felt great. It felt wonderful to be myself and to not feel ashamed about it, and maybe even to feel ashamed, but to struggle with that and to put myself in the position of having to not feel okay and to work through that day in, day out, and interact with people at work and in school, and just be myself and be honest about who I was and what I was going through. And no one ever approached me for several months after that experience. And I think it might have been because I think I was more okay with it than I had ever been in my life, and people felt that. The next experience I wanted to share with you was that winter when I came home. I was sitting in a cafe. I was waiting for an order. I was sitting at a bench with a friend, and this woman walked in, and she was in line to place her order, but instead of waiting to go to the cashier or cash register, she came up to me and she sort of slid right next to me and put her arm around my shoulder, and with great confidence, she said, "You look great. How are you feeling?" And my first thought was, she thinks I have cancer, and I don't want her to think I have cancer. This is like my worst nightmare. Why is this happening? But it was such that I felt such at that point that I was confident enough to say to her, I looked her in the eye and I said, I don't have cancer. And I think she was so taken aback, because alopecia is such a rare disease. People assume that if you don't have hair, you're going through cancer. They don't think about alopecia. And I think she felt so embarrassed that she had put me in a potentially uncomfortable position that she very quickly withdrew and left. And before I even had a chance to explain, it's okay, I just have alopecia. Thank you for trying to offer me some support and kindness. I appreciate it. The other experience I had was with my nephew, who was 7 years old at the time. I was visiting from out of town. My family lives in New Hampshire. I live in Virginia. I was home for a long weekend. And my nephew was visiting my mom's place. And I had washed my wig and I was letting it dry in a spare room, and my nephew had found it. And I was sitting in the living room with a head cap on, and we had never talked about the issue of alopecia. He had seen me with a head cap before, but he had never asked me why I didn't have hair. But he came up to me and very point blank, he said, I found the wig. And with him, this conversation was different because he's a little kid. And I'm like, what do I say to a little kid? How do I explain what alopecia is so he can understand? And again, I think honesty is the best policy because it ultimately lets you off the hook. You don't lie. You don't have to cover your tracks. And it shows people that you're confident enough to talk about it, even if you're not feeling confident, even if you start to cry, which was very often the case when I first came down with this disease. I couldn't even talk about it without turning into a puddle on the floor, as I think I've mentioned in a previous video. And so with my nephew, I took the same approach. And thankfully, I'd had some experience working with kids as a therapist, but also just in my family, and knowing him, knowing the kid that he is, he appreciates honesty, as I think most kids do. And I said, no, I have alopecia, and it means nothing more than the fact that I don't have hair. I can still go on bike rides with you. I can take you on hikes. I can play outside with you, play baseball. I can take you swimming, and we can still do all the same things that we've been loving to do together. I just don't have hair, and I wear a wig to blend in. And he seemed satisfied with that explanation. He didn't ask me any questions about what it was like to have alopecia or what the disease was and all this stuff. He just went about the rest of his afternoon, and he hasn't asked me about it since. And I think to him, I'm still the same old Auntie Chris, and that's just fine for him. So the things that I've taken away from these experiences is that there's so much that is going on in those interactions that you don't always anticipate. You don't anticipate your own internal response of feeling ashamed and nervous and scared to talk about whatever it is going on for you, how to put it in context for someone who doesn't know about alopecia, how to express it in a concise way for someone who doesn't know you or the situation in a way that just quickly nips the question in the bud, and you can just move on with the rest of your day. It's okay to acknowledge those things, those feelings, because they exist. And I think when we don't acknowledge them, we make the process all that much more difficult for ourselves and for the other person. I've also learned that people treat you as they are and not necessarily as you are. So if you see someone who's staring at you out of the corner of their eye because God knows why, because they're judging you, because they're afraid of you, because they're uncomfortable around you, that is their issue and not anything that should affect how you treat yourself or feel about yourself in that moment. It's good to acknowledge how crappy it might make you feel, because that's honest and that's a reality, but it means nothing about your value or your worth as a person. And I've met some people through the National Alopecia Areata Foundation, volunteers who go to Capitol Hill or go to their representatives' offices where they live, and who have shared stories of approaching people in the grocery store or in church who seem to be looking at them as though they have a question on their face. And they've gone up and they've called it. They've been the ones to take control of that scenario and to say, I have alopecia. I notice you're bald too, for example. And they break the ice that way. So I hope these experiences that I've shared are helpful for you. The overarching theme I think that's important to remember is that you can't control how people are going to react to you, as these scenarios, these examples illustrate, but you can control how you respond. And I think honesty is the best way of approaching questions that ultimately will come our way about alopecia, and honesty with ourselves about how the questions make us feel and how we feel about having alopecia, because once we acknowledge those feelings, we gain confidence and familiarity with them, and it just helps overall deal with life and with alopecia from my experience. So I hope this is helpful for you. Please like my page on YouTube. Please also visit my website at alopecianlife.wordpress.com and give me your email address, join my mailing list. Please also remember that there is a lot of life to live and a lot of love to give, even when you don't have hair. Thank you so much for joining me. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.